The dossier was sealed under a layer of yellowing tape stamped Office of Strategic Services, Restricted Equine Assets, May 1945. Somewhere along its journey through vaults, basements, and forgotten filing cabinets, a clerk had scrawled in pencil across the front: "The only cavalry charge of the European war that didn't involve gunfire." Beneath those words lay one of the strangest, most quietly miraculous operations ever undertaken in the final days of the Second World War. A mission launched in a world collapsing into fire, one last moment of defiant humanity amidst a continent drowning in ruin. It began not with soldiers, not with generals, but with horses, the Lipizzaners, the white stallions of Vienna, the pride of the Spanish riding school, animals bred over centuries into symbols of classical Europe. By 1945, the Third Reich was disintegrating. Nazi officials, and especially the SS, were scrambling to seize anything of value before the end. Artifacts, paintings, gold, archives, and among their prize collections, Europe's finest horses. The Lipizzaners had been moved east early in the war to the Czech borderlands for safekeeping. They ended up at a stud farm in Hostau, in German-occupied Czechoslovakia. From there, hundreds of valuable stallions and mares, Lipizzaners, Arabians, thoroughbreds, were stockpiled like cultural loot behind barbed wire. But as the Red Army approached from the east, something darker took shape. Soviet commanders considered the horses either spoils or food. There were quiet orders for requisition. Many feared the worst. The Lipizzaners were running out of time. At the heart of the crisis stood Alois Podhajski, the director of the Spanish riding school, a man who saw in the approaching chaos a second death of Vienna's heritage. He had no army, no weapons, no authority, only a desperate need to save his life's work. He sent pleas through every channel still functioning in the war's final month. Some messages never arrived, others were ignored, but one of them, through a chain of improbable coincidence, reached a headquarters in Bavaria where an American general with an unpredictable streak read it with interest. General George S. Patton, a cavalryman before he was an armored commander, a rider before he was a warrior, a man who once said an army without horses had forgotten its soul. The moment he read the request, Patton asked only one question: "Can we get them out?" And even before receiving an answer, he gave permission, unofficial, verbal, nothing recorded on paper. A handshake, a nod, and a command delivered with typical Patton brevity: "Save the horses." This would become Operation Cowboy. The task fell to elements of the 2nd Cavalry Group, mechanized, American troopers who, in the chaos of the collapsing Reich, still moved with discipline and resolve. Their commander, Colonel Charles Reed, received the strange request without irony. In the spring of 1945, the war was ending in a blur of cities lost, prisoners freed, and armies surrendering by the tens of thousands. But this mission, crossing into German-held territory to seize a farm full of horses, was different. The Lipizzaners were behind enemy lines. Hostau was defended by German units. SS elements were active in the area, and the Soviets were pushing west with their own interpretation of liberation. The Americans prepared to thread the needle between these forces with a mission that officially did not exist. Reed assembled a mixed team: troopers, veterinarians, translators, a handful of scouts, and a few men who had ridden horses long before they drove armored cars. They moved northeast across Bavaria, advancing through villages where white flags hung from shattered windows, where civilians watched in silent relief or silent fear. Along the way, something unexpected happened. German soldiers, Wehrmacht, not SS, came forward waving makeshift flags of truce. They weren't surrendering for survival. They were surrendering with a purpose. They wanted to help save the horses. These were the German handlers and veterinarians stationed at Hostau. They despised the SS, feared the Soviets, and trusted that only the Americans would spare the animals. The war had reduced men to ideological enemies, but in the strange neutrality of a stable they found common ground. They defected. They offered intelligence. They provided maps, guard rosters, weapon placements. One even risked execution to sketch the stud farm's layout from memory. The Americans listened. The Germans pointed toward a heavily forested region marked by small rivers and stone farmhouses. The Soviet line was only days away. If the Russians reached Hostau first, the Lipizzaners would be swallowed by the front. And so the Americans pushed deeper into enemy territory. Faster, quieter, more urgently. At dawn on April 28, 1945, they arrived at Hostau. The village was tense. German forces still held it. SS patrols prowled nearby roads. But the handlers inside the stud farm welcomed the Americans as if they were rescuing a cathedral. What followed looked nothing like warfare. Troopers dismounted from armored cars. Handlers opened stable doors. Horses stamped nervously inside dim barns as gunfire crackled in the distance. Then the firing grew closer. An SS unit had learned of the American advance. They were closing fast, and the farm, filled with soldiers, civilians, and hundreds of terrified horses, was caught in the middle. The Americans took defensive positions along the road. Veterinarians shouted warnings. German handlers ushered the horses into inner courtyards. American machine guns barked across the hedgerows. The skirmish was brief but sharp. The SS retreated. The stud farm held. Now came the impossible task, moving hundreds of horses, including pregnant mares, prize stallions, and young foals, across a war-ravaged countryside. Operation Cowboy was no longer a rescue. It was an evacuation. Under gray skies, the Americans and Germans formed a column unlike any other in the Second World War. Mechanized cavalry vehicles, armed troopers, veterinarians, Hostau civilians, captured Wehrmacht handlers. And at the center, the Lipizzaners, streaming out in a long line of pale bodies and frightened eyes. They marched through villages still smoldering from retreating German forces. They crossed bridges that creaked under the weight of horseshoes. They passed checkpoints where American soldiers stared confused as Reed's column waved them aside. No one could quite believe what they were seeing. An entire stud farm on the move, guarded by men from both sides of the war. By the time they reached American lines, the horses were exhausted. But they were alive, intact, and safe. Patton himself rode out to inspect them. Witnesses later described the scene, the general stepping forward with unusual softness, running a hand down the neck of a white stallion, murmuring to it like a man greeting an old friend. "These," he said, "are the last of Europe's culture. We couldn't let them die." The Lipizzaners were brought to Bavaria for safekeeping. Some would later return to Austria. Others would be distributed among Allied forces to ensure their bloodlines survived. Decades later, their descendants still perform at the Spanish riding school in Vienna, living symbols of a Europe reborn from war. Operation Cowboy faded quietly into the footnotes of the war, the story of American cavalry troopers who crossed enemy lines not to seize territory or destroy a target, but to preserve something fragile, elegant, irreplaceable. It was a mission executed not for strategy, nor propaganda, nor victory, but for principle. A mission approved without paperwork. A mission ordered with a simple handshake. A mission reminding the world that even in the final days of the Second World War, when cities burned and armies collapsed, there were still moments when men risked their lives not to take, but to save. This was the rescue of the Lipizzaners. This was the last quiet miracle of the European war. This was the mission that defied the logic of 1945 and succeeded because humanity for once outranked orders.